Hello, everyone. It's Joe here again. Part two of our logging series. I was trying to find you some pictures online of the operation we ran, and it's interesting. There aren't very many pictures, and back in those days, we didn't take many pictures. It's not like nowadays you have a picture on their phone and take, people take pictures of everything. They take pictures of what they're eating for dinner and lunch and breakfast. But back in those days, we didn't have cell phones and really didn't have cameras. I mean, we had them, but why take them to work? We had no reason to. So it was pretty tough trying to find pictures of our logging operation. But I did find some interesting ones. It looks like the first one you see on the screen probably was taken around the 40s or 50s in Oregon or Washington. But the gear that they're using, the cables, everything they're using is what we used and when we were logging in Southeast Alaska. You can see the cable above the log. Um, that's called the big chain link, so it looks like a chain. That's called the butt rigging. And that one gentleman is hanging onto a cable that's attached to the log. That's a choker. And so these men, now this is a big crew. You got 9 guys there. Um, I'm sure they had big crews back then. It's funny because in Washington and Oregon, not Oregon, uh, they they had big logging operations as well, but they also had the OSHA, which is a safety regulation government um, agency. And so they kind of kept an eye on the logging operations, and it wasn't as dangerous as it was in Alaska. In Alaska, we had 125 logging camps, and it was literally impossible for the safety government agency OSHA to keep up on it, on the operations. Basically, you're highly competitive operations were small companies trying to survive. Your larger companies were more relaxed, and they could absorb the loss of production over safety. So those larger companies weren't highly productive like the like I told you earlier. A lot of operations I worked on were highball operations, production. Everything was production fast. You had to run everywhere. Speed was important. So let's look at this picture. You got the log, typical size log, um, probably 6, 7, 8 foot through at the stump. We've had a lot of these in the southeast Alaska when we're logging. And now these guys have the luxury of the cable was strung really high, probably very high up in the trees. And you had to have the hook tender, the climber, to get that cable up there. So, but in Alaska, we didn't have that luxury. Most of our trees weren't that tall, but they were big around like this. Of course, the big ones we cut down, so we couldn't use those as what they call lift trees to elevate the cable. So most of our operations were on the ground. These cables were dragged down the ground rather than lifted up nicely like this. And you can see the attire, the dress of these men, suspenders, and just like us, they cut their pant legs off above their boots and cut their sleeves off above their wrists. And the only thing different about these guys, they didn't have tin hats. They didn't have the steel hats, which is pretty tough to operate without a tin hat. I'm sure a lot of guys got head injuries because you always have that cable, and that cable is always swinging around and knocks you upside the head. and which didn't hurt when you're wearing a steel helmet. But without a steel helmet, it probably caused a few headaches back in those days. But this is it. This is what the logging operation looked like. Um, I have some more pictures that I'll bring up. In this picture, you see exactly what I'm talking about. You have the men wearing tin hats. This is probably taken more in the 70s or 1980s. Um, but you see the two men, they're setting a choker, the cable around the log. And the man on top of the log is passing the choker dog, the cable, the choker. And he has to dig underneath that log to get that cable underneath it to wrap it. And so it takes, it's not easy to dig through all that brush. Sometimes it's really muddy, especially in the southeast Alaska where it's a rainforest. You have to dig through the mud and push that cable through. But they're usually, you know, these guys have the luxury of two people wrapping a log with this cable, but normally you're only one person. It's a one person job, so you can see how you'd be jumping back and forth over the top, pushing through, then coming back and connecting the cable together to the what they call the choker bell, where it connects to get together. But this guy, these guys are smart because you can see this log laying against a stump, so it's not going to roll. I'm sure they saw that stump there, so they didn't mind getting downhill the log. There's no chance of it rolling. And the stumps were our safeties. You're always conscious of being around the stump because what happens is when they're pulling these logs in, sometimes these cables break and you can hear them snap, and you have to have lightning fast reaction to just dive behind a stump. And this is probably the most dangerous parts of the logging in the rigging crew is when these cables snap. I mean, they're whipping, hundreds of miles an hour, and you just you can't get in the way. I watched one. Uh, I guess we call him greenhorn. The guy just started logging, and we warned him. We said, always stand beside a stump. Always be conscious. You have to be, you never know. These cables can snap anytime, things will fly in the air. You hear something, you just duck. You duck behind a stump because things are going to be flying. And sure enough, it wasn't about an hour later, and one of the chokers snapped, dragging in a log, and it came flying back. I think it broke I'm not sure what part of it. Anyhow, it broke the nubbin off the choker, which is hold this choker bell on. And the choker bell went flying through there, probably, hundreds of miles an hour. And it took the button off his shirt. If he would have been, quarter inch, half inch stepped farther into the forward, it would have took his chest right out of his, what totally killed him. But anyhow, that's the type of dangers we were into, and that's why you had to be fast. You had to be lightning fast. Of course, every operation was different. What I did, I moved around camp to camp. It was not a big deal to quit one camp and go to the next because it was there were so many camps, and the owner says, "Yeah, we'll see you when you get back. It's not a big deal. You want to go check out other logging operations, come back anytime you want." And I was always gravitated towards the highball operations, where there was a challenge, extreme challenge of trying to get production every day. And I think the good Lord kind of prompted my heart to do that because those challenges, those extreme heavy labor, I think was preparing me for the Arctic expeditions, which is extreme heavy labor. when you're doing a solo Arctic expedition, you have 22 Alaskan Malamutes. Some of them weigh as much as you do. It's extreme, heavy physical labor, snowshoeing, skiing every day, setting up camp, harnessing dogs, taking care of the dogs. Then you have to endure unbelievable weather. You can't even comprehend how brutal some of these blizzards are. I couldn't even describe it. And I think all these years I spent down in Southeast Alaska, all these summers, I would only log in the summer, was just kind of a preparation, of what's coming ahead. And that's how, our good Lord works. He prepares us, always preparing us. And it's not for our benefit, actually. Most of the things that we do in life are for others, to inspire others, to help others. And regardless of what we do, you know, we can't attribute our strengths to ourselves. It's probably the most damaging thing we can do to ourselves. I see these young athletes standing up on the podium in the Olympics or Tour de France, which is going on right now with the cycling in Europe. They get up on the podium and they practically break their arms, patting themselves on the back, and their talents are given to them by God. I mean, we should never ever take credit for our talents. They're given to us and lent to us, and we always have to thank God for what He's given us, whether it's health or whatever. But nonetheless, these camps were kind of the training ground for me, I think. And maybe I was gravitated. I was really attracted to the extreme challenges of some of these little operations that, it's really highly competitive. They just had to get a certain number log count every day, and you did everything you could to do this. And it was. I moved around quite a few camps to check out other operations. A lot of camps were relaxed. Almost like having whole hum board setting chokers or pulling rigging, they used to call it. And I just quit. I'd go back to my high ball operations where I had a challenge, extreme challenge. So I'll go to the next picture. Now this picture I took out of actually a OSHA safety manual showing how the logger operation works. You can see how many cables there are. Cables were everywhere, and these were they're big cables, but they still wouldn't take much to break them, especially when you compare them to this, the enormous force the yarder is pulling on these. And this is one of the jobs of rigging slinger I told you earlier about. He carried the walkie-talkie and gave signals to the engineer who operated the yarder, who was pulling the logs into the landing. There was different signals for the yarder engineer to pull harder or to ease off. And so the rigging slinger, you had this. When I was a rigging slinger, I would stand up on top of a stump so I could see the logs go in toward the landing. And if they're being dragged in by the yarder, you had to make sure they had a clear path. Now, if a log come up against a stump and you didn't do anything about it, the log would hit the stump and break the cable, break the choker, which a lot of times that wasn't a bad deal. I mean, some of the cheap chokers, you need new chokers, so you didn't mind breaking one that was really torn up and needed to be changed anyhow. But it's just an inconvenience to run down there and re-choke it. So, and a lot of times, if you had 2 or 3 logs that hung up on a stump at the same stump. Now these butt riggings, they pulled 3 logs at a time, and if 3 of them come up against a hard pull, you could actually pull that yarder over. If you told the yarder engineer by a signal to pull harder, He didn't know what was going on. He would just be pulling harder. All of a sudden, the whole tower would come down, and I've seen that happen, and that puts a big danger. The chaser, of course, the experienced chaser, when that happens, he runs underneath the yarder where he's safe from all the cables falling. But once that tower comes down, it's usually destroyed. So it's a big deal. You don't want to do that. So the rigging slinger had it was his job to keep that from, prevent that from happening. And so when you're pulling rigging as a rigging slinger, you had your little walkie-talkie in your hand that hung off your belt and giving the yarder engineer certain signals. Either slow down, pick it up, pull harder. So you watch that cable, and if those logs, if they came up against a stump, you stop the engineer and you told him, three signals, I think, was going backwards. I can't remember what it was. It's been a long time. But three signals, three beeps, which send the butt rigging coming back and pull the logs backwards. And if you stopped at just the right time, then you could go ahead on it, maybe tight line it, which would mean put more pressure on the main line, which might pick up the logs a little bit and flip them over the stump. It was quite an art, and it took a long time to learn all these little tricks of the trade. But this is why the rigging slinger was such a, he was in danger all the time, because he's standing up on a stump watching these logs go in. Something breaks, he's right vulnerable. I mean, he's in the way of flying cables. But you had to be fast too. You had to be keeping an eye out. You had to be aware of everything that's going on, and you had to make sure your crew was always behind you. Your choker setters, choker dogs, were always behind you, behind a stump. And you told them, stay here behind this stump. I'm gonna go watch this. They called it turn. I'm gonna go watch this turn go in, and make sure nothing gets hung up. So it was a lot more to it than just just going out there and pulling trees in with a cable. And this picture is a pretty good picture. It kind of exhibits the whole operation. It's interesting. It came out of a safety manual. This next picture, obviously a very old one, but it's interesting. We still use that gear when we were logging in the 80s, 1980s in the southeast Alaska. But you can see the log coming in on the cable, held up in the air, and the chaser on the stack of logs is ready to unhook it and send it back out. I mean, this is so typical of the operation. You can see just so many cables. You just had to be careful. When things went bad, they went bad. This next photo is kind of my favorite. You can see a man up there cutting the top of the tree off. Of course, we didn't have these tall trees. It was probably taken in Oregon or Washington. Alaska, they were big around, but they weren't this tall. So we didn't have the pleasure of climbing quite this high. But nonetheless, we had to cut the tops off. And it's really interesting. Even that's quite an art. You notice how the tree has no limbs. Well, that logger, while he was climbing up that tree, had to cut those limbs off. And so what you do, you got these big spikes on your boots, and you have a belt that goes around the tree, and you basically start climbing, and you have ropes attached to your belt. And with these ropes is attached a chainsaw. And so when you come to a limb, you pull the chainsaw up with a rope, and you cut the limbs off, and you keep going. And finally getting up to where you think it's high enough to give the logs some lift, the cable some lift, get them off the ground a little ways. And you cut the top of the tree off. Now this, you would think, well, it's not a big deal, cut the top of the tree off. But the problem is, when these trees fall over, like you see in the picture, when they start to topple, of course, you want to make sure you get a good cut, and you want the make sure it goes with the wind. You don't want the top to fall back on you. But when it topples off and falls off, that tree, while you're up there, you're like riding a bronco. I mean, it just rocking back and forth, and all you can do is just hang on. And you just have to wait for it to stop rocking. That's quite a feeling, to say the least. I mean, it's interesting. And then once you're to the top, you have these other ropes that are hooked to your block and tackles. So you pull those up, pull your straps up to attach the tackles to the block and tackle to the tree. Then you have another rope that's attached to the smaller cable, which they call it haywire. It's a 7/16 cable, and they're in 100-foot rolls. And like I said the other day, they're about anywhere from 45 to 50 pounds per roll. So you're just pulling one end up, running it through the block and tackle, and you pull another roll up one end, run that through the block and tackle, and those will feed your main cables through the block and tackle. So it's quite a process, and it's not something you spend too much time at, because the crew is still working hard and they're hustling, trying to keep up a good log count, get production, and you got to be fast. You got to be fast climbing up, cutting that tree off, stringing your lines, and getting down and get to the next tree. It's a real challenge. So, but it's a lot of fun for a young guy. Basically, you know, you very seldom. Oh, there'd be a few guys out there 38 years old, but after about 40 years old, you just don't have it anymore. Not physically, anyhow. Mentally, you do. You know. But anyhow, it was a challenge, and those days are gone. Apparently, I don't see any more of those type of logging operations anymore. So it's all part of history. What's the most interesting thing about that job, working as a logger, was some of the people you met. I mean, these guys were tough, and some were real characters. You know, they're a really interesting bunch. Not all of them, but a good amount of them were pretty interesting. They're rough characters. Um, most of them were pretty healthy. They didn't drink or smoke, but there were a good crowd that did. And every weekend they would go into the town, Petersburg, Wrangell, Sitka, all the southeast towns, and just raise cane. They would really raise a lot of hell. And the funny thing is, so the people, the villagers, and townsfolks, they just pegged us as all ruffians. And it wasn't uncommon to get injured and be medevaced out. I was medevaced out. I don't know, half a dozen times probably. And one of the times I had to go to town and get stitched up. I had, it was a weird injury. I've never had to go to town for such a minor injury, but it was bad because I was bleeding like crazy. What happened was I got hit with a choker in my lip, and it split my lip wide open. It's like it broke it. And that's what they said. Oh, you broke your lip. You better get to town and get stitched up. You couldn't smile. So sure enough, they flew me to town, and I got off to play and searched out which doctor to go to. They told me which address, and they were waiting for me. So my lip, it wasn't a big emergency or anything. It just looked awful. It was blood everywhere. And so I got in there. They cleaned it up, and I sat back on a chair actually, and the doctor started sewing me, and I said, "Do you use number? You want to numb that up first?" He says, "You're a logger, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay," and he just sewed me up without any numb medicine. I'm not, just I felt every needle. But that's I guess that was our reputation. That, we're a different breed, I guess, and they treat us as such. I don't know if we're second class citizens or what, but they treat us that way. But I wasn't foreign to being sewn up without numb medicine. I wasn't unfamiliar with it. I had to do that myself on several injuries while I was on the trap line in the mountains. I had to sew myself up, I think, 2 or 3 different times. And of course, you don't have anything to numb yourself with, but you just did what you had to do to survive. But he had an option. He could have made it pleasant for me. But we all, well, unfortunately, one bad apple can, you know, ruin a bushel, and we all had a reputation of being ruffians, and that's how we were treated. And but nonetheless, we had it was a good crowd. Every logger was good-hearted. I think that such extreme hard work humbled a man. It really humbles you. And it makes you value life because you seeing your buddies getting broken up, out of commission, maybe the rest of their lives, or you see a buddy get killed. I mean, you become very humbled and you thank God every day for just being alive. And it's a really humbling experience, really humbling. And then you had your other crowd that went to the logging camps to escape, to hide from the law. And one time I was working at, I think it was Rowan Bay, Sitka, Alaska, and a trooper flew in an airplane, and we were just starting, get out to get is in the morning. Everybody was loading up in the crummy, head out to the landings to go to work, and I looked around. I was missing one of my choker dogs. I said, "What happened to Mike?" Oh, you know, he just disappeared. He was ready to get on the crummy, and he just disappeared right when that trooper flown in. I thought, no. So, and someone said, "Hey, we saw a guy running down the road there." Um, so we took off in a pickup truck, grabbed the side rods pickup truck, and told him we had to go find one of our crew members, and we finally caught up to him. I mean, this guy could run. This guy could run. He ran, I don't know how many miles down a dirt road, and he was right to the water's edge. We were on an island, and he was getting ready to steal a boat and take off. I said, "Mike, what are you doing?" He says, "The troopers are after me." I said, "Well, they already got their man. They already hauled off some guy, and they flew away. You don't have to worry about anything. I don't know what you did," I said, "but it must have been pretty bad, but it's time to get to work." So there were those type guys too. It just made a lot of interesting stories to tell later on. Like I'm telling you, and good memories too. But there was always some dark sides of the logging industry when people were injured and whatnot, killed. Um, and everyone was vulnerable. We were all vulnerable. You never knew. You just never knew when your time would come, or you'd get broken up, or get in an accident. I laugh about it now because the scene was, it was, it was although the scene coming up I'm talking about, I'll be talking about, was life threatening. It was also funny. And it all started a day, I was rigging center, phone rigging, and I told everybody, get behind the stump in case these logs roll. We're on a really steep pitch here, and these logs could roll any moment. Just make sure you're standing behind a stump in case one rolls down. And just stay here. I told my choker dog, stay here, and I'm going to go see which logs to pick out for the next turn. And I no sooner stepped away from the stump, and here come the log rolling down the hill. Boom, 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 boom. And I tried to get back to my stump, and it got me. It rolled right on top of me, over me, bounced off another log, rolled back a little ways, and stopped right on me. So here I was laying parallel with the log, and the log laying on top of me. And the log was about 3 or 4 foot through. So it weighed thousands and thousands of pounds. And luckily, it had been raining a lot that day, and I was laying in the mud, and it just pressed me into the mud. Nonetheless, it was taking my life out of me. Every breath I took, I couldn't gather. My breath would get smaller as the weight was compressing me, and I realized that. And of course, meanwhile, I was whispering prayers, which I think saved my life. But the funny thing was, my crew, they're young kids, 18, 19 years old. They see their boss dying, and they freaked out. And one of the kids, you know, he bent over and said, "Hey, Joe, I'm gonna go get a chainsaw. We'll cut this log off you." I said, "Don't you dare get a chainsaw." I said, "I'll fire you if you get a chainsaw." And I said, "Look, I can't talk much anymore." Grab my walkie-talkie from my belt. You can get to it, and bend over and try to push that button and talk into it. Tell the yarder engineer that I'm under a log, and when you guys place a cable around this log, which you will soon, I hope, tell them to tightline it, which means try to pick that cable up straight up and don't drag it. Don't try to pull the log, because that would certainly do a lot of damage. But try to have him tightline those lines as tight as he dares to do before they start breaking, to lift this thing off me. So first I can breathe, and second I might be a squirm out of here. and so sure enough, the kid reached down and grabbed my talkie tutor, they call them, the little walkie-talkie, and gave the yarder engineer the exact instructions I gave him. And they wrapped the cable around that log, dug underneath the mud. I think they wrapped it right above my head there. I couldn't move. I was totally pinned down. And I was saving my breath. I knew each breath I took was getting smaller and smaller. And I knew eventually I wouldn't be able to take another breath. And sure enough, they pulled it off. And I'm here to tell you the story. Now, if they would have used a chainsaw, it would. Those kids weren't too good at using a chainsaw. I hate to see what would they do when they finish cutting through that log. I'd probably keep going. But so these were like I said, every year you'd have injuries. And I was medevaced out. Like I said, I can't remember how many times, but it happened. And I've seen a lot of kids get broken up, busted, and out of commission probably for the rest of their life. And so those were but like I said, even though there were dark times, they very much humbled the man. And it made you realize that, it's providence. Everything happens for a reason. And so you just have to be thankful for every day and take everything as they come. Roll with the punches, they say. I hope you enjoyed this story. There's many more to come. In the meantime, I'm going to get outside and take care of the dogs. It's still smoky skies at 82 degrees above zero. So we are in a hot, hot summer this year, but it's like this every year. Alaska's not cold all the time. we always have 80-degree weather and smoke-filled skies from all the forest fires. And, if you're not familiar with this type scenario, you think the world's coming to an end, especially when the ashes are raining down like snow. But like I said, you go with the punches, and thank God for every day, and have faith and hope. And until next time, God bless.